All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you guys are all doing well and surviving our very own end times here in the year 2020 as Nurgle's plague does indeed ravage our planet. Pretty much all we need now are the denizens of the warp to start appearing in reality, and I think that will complete our glorious year. Nonetheless, guys, we're here today to take our mind off all that nonsense and just have a little bit of a discussion. So it's going to be a casual video, just kind of talking about my opinion on the subject. And it's one of the most common questions I get asked. What is the most powerful faction in Total War Warhammer 2 multiplayer? And of course, it's a commonly asked question because, people in a competitive sense want to get in, they want to invest their time in a good faction. And this faction certainly is extremely powerful, and I would say does have a relatively high skill cap as well, and is also widely hated in the competitive multiplayer community. But I have to say, I do indeed enjoy this faction. Now, this video is going to be talking about the most powerful faction in multiplayer. Like I said, again, multiplayer. We're not going to be touching upon anything pertaining to campaign. And though I do think this faction is very, very good in campaign, certainly has some teeth, it doesn't have this, I don't think it has the infrastructure to quite make it one of the most powerful factions overall in a macro sense. As far as an isolated battle environment, though, in campaign, they're pretty insane for sure. And they have a really good doom stack, and I certainly think could be a contender for one of the more powerful factions in general, but not the most powerful. However, in multiplayer, I think I can safely say that the Vampire Coast is hands down the most powerful faction. And they are just such a menace for sure. Now, they do have a couple hard counters in the form of the dwarves, and perhaps the Empire from time to time. Some Empire players, of course, I really do enjoy this matchup and feel they have an advantage against Coast, and I do as well. But in general, I think that Vampire Coast is an extremely powerful faction. And when you put Vampire Coast in the hands of a top-level player, they become extremely difficult to defeat, for sure. Now, let's go ahead and talk about why they're so powerful. So firstly, the Vampire Coast is an undead faction. And undead factions, since the dawn of time, since the inception of Warhammer 1, have always been really strong in multiplayer for a multitude of reasons. So firstly, they're a little bit more forgiving in many ways. Their units are essentially unbreakable in the traditional sense. They have what's called the crumbling mechanic or the disintegrating mechanic. And basically, when a unit that is undead goes below a certain leadership threshold or goes into negative leadership, instead of breaking and running like an Empire unit would or a Dwarf unit or any, pretty much a living character, they start to crumble. So during this period of time, those undead units are going to be taking 10 HP damage per second. Now, I personally feel that crumbling should be a little bit more punishing because when you have these like zombie pirate deckhand mobs that have just a massive erect HP pool, have access to Invocation of Nehek, if you're playing vampires, like Mortis Engine effects pretty much counterbalance like the crumbling mechanic. It like really negates the punishment of it. I think crumbling could be tuned a little bit because obviously there's the threshold, right? A unit's going to start crumbling, and then from there, it's not going to really suffer harder crumbling until it gets to the point of disintegrating or army losses, which is like a really, really long, far away threshold from the beginning of crumbling. I think that crumbling should perhaps have a scaling system. So if they're at like -5, it's going to be the minimum, right? It might be -10, but if they're at like -50 or 60 or whatever, -30. Something substantial, it's going to like scale accordingly because I feel right now crumbling is a little bit, it's just not punishing enough. Whereas like other factions, are going to break and run. Vampire Coast is usually just going to endure, and then the leadership will just stabilize once they're able to bring in one of their really powerful lords. But again, on that subject, they are an undead faction, and a lot of the undead factions in the early days, or I should say the only undead faction, Vampire Counts, it was kind of like a trade-off, right? Because Vampire Counts didn't have access to ranged units, they didn't have access to carronades, handgun mobs, gunnery mobs, bombers, like all these incredible units. So you kind of were like, all right, it's going to be a little bit tough to actually break these undead units. I'm going to have to do it the old-fashioned way, burn through the riches, which is whatever, go straight Rob Zombie on these hoes. But with Vampire Coast, it's like, they have all the strengths of the Vampire Counts. They have the same gooning potential. They have incredibly powerful Vampire Lords. They have access to the Invocation of Nehek. They have Terrorgeists of their own, which, don't have bonus first large, but a little bit more generalist. They can pretty much do a lot of what Vampire Counts can do. I mean, they lack heavy cab, but they still have mobility. They have Scurvy Dogs, they have Deck Droppers, they have Fellbats. They have a lot of mobility, so it's not like you're really losing out that much. But anyways, they're undead faction. They're relatively speaking unbreakable, which is so good for gunline factions. And that's another thing that makes Vampire Coast so crazy. You have traditional gunline factions like Empire, you have dwarves, and you have Skaven, and all these factions that oftentimes do bring a substantial backline of some sorts, depending on the matchup. And those backlines can be compromised by pendulums, by fellbats, by skirmish cav, by heavy cavalry, just getting into the backline, causing disruption, which is a viable strategy for beating them. Now, with Vampire Coast, I've seen Vampire Coast players play in a way where they simply just layer handguns in the backline en masse, and they're like, we don't care about defending our backline. They're not going to break. You want to leave your cavalry units for 5 minutes to clear through 7,000 HP of a deckhand mob or whatever? Go be my guest while I crossfire at you. So that's the thing. You can't really shock down and break down a Vampire Coast backline that easily. It's incredibly tough. And that's one of the things that makes having ranged assets like they do, plus the unbreakable nature of the Undead, so damn strong. So again, being Undead and a gunline faction or having access to gunline choices is incredibly good. Another reason why I think Vampire Coast is a top tier faction is they have some of the best lords, if not the best lords in the entire game. I think Luther Harkin is, in multiplayer, the best lord in the game. He's incredibly good. He has a great mount option with his Terrorgeist. You pretty much never see him on foot, but you wouldn't you just look at him and you're like, okay, let's look at Luther Harkin, right? He's got his Goose. He rides a Terror Goose. He's got 44, 42, 460 with poison. It's all right, right? It's not like, a 500 plus lord up in the sky who can really just hammer you down. Karl Franz rocking 490, but what's crazy about Luther is that number one, he's obviously does poison. So when he's in a duelist situation, the poison is going to be incredibly big. He's got 460 weapon strength, really good AP value. So he has all the basic benchmarks of being a really good duelist lord. But a big but here, his abilities are so good. He has Hornswaggle, so he can slow their speed by 24%, lower their armor by 30, their melee defense. He can basically hunt them into the Shadow Realm. It is so good. But more importantly, guys, this is the big factor why he's so good. His damned pistol. So Luther Harkin has this freaking hand cannon of a gun. It does 444 missile strength, amazing AP values, and it also actually adds a miscast chance and a negative 10% physical resist to whatever he's shooting. So let's say Luther Harkin is going fisticuffs with Karl Franz. Franz pops Reikland Runefang. He pops Gal Miraz. He's going deep for Sigmar. He's going in there hard, baby. Well, Luther Harkin he can cackle, he can run, he'll just kite you, and while you're chasing him, he's just going to be shooting you with the pistol. So then you're like, okay, screw this shit, I'm going to go somewhere else. Karl Franz lands, goes after something else. Guess who comes back? Luther Harkin's coming back. He's still shooting you with the pistol. He's using his breath attack. He's hornswaggling you. He's rear charging you. As soon as you try and fight back, he can pull away. And another thing is, since Luther Harkin has so much freaking ammo, 50 shots, even if there's a bad situation for him on the ground, he can simply fly overhead and just do huge damage against any number of targets with his pistol. And while he's fighting you in melee combat, so let's say Luther is fighting Karl Franz up in the sky, not only is he going to be poisoning you, hitting you with 460 melee weapon strength, but he's also going to be shooting you with a pistol at the same time, adding a negative 10 physical resist and doing another basically 444 missile damage. Of course, it's calculated a little bit differently with that, but it's insane. Like, he has such good damage output, such good durability. And even though he's undead and people are like, oh yeah, you can get him to crumble, you can't really. Luther Harkin is more or less unbreakable. His base leadership is 80, and I've seen Luther with like 50 HP just flying around the battlefield being a terror. He is so difficult to actually break, and I can't tell you how many games I've seen with Vampire Coast where he just hard carries. So Vampire Coast is undead. They have all the benefits of being undead, and none of the real like drawbacks of like being a linear kind of a limited faction. And it's just insane. And on the subject of their lords again, Count Noctilus is also a top tier lord. Anti-large, armor piercing, access to the best lore magic in the game. And also if he wants to get shadows mixed in there, he can. He has two great abilities with Roth's Moondial, which is an item, as well as the Wraithstorm, which is a great bombardment. Just so good. And all the baseline vampire lords aren't bad, depending on the lore magic you want to use. The Vampire Fleet Admirals are really good. The pistols are incredible. The halberd variants are good. And even their like worst lords, or their quote unquote weaker lords, Aranis Assault Spite and or Big Thickness Celestor Direfin, dwarf players would like weep to have a lord as good as Aranessa. But like, Vampire Coast players are like, oh, get that trash out of here. We want Luther Harkin and Noctilus and our top tier lords. But like, the dwarves would just have a straight up hard on to have a character like Aranis Assault Spite. She has like nets, she has anti-large, she has armor piercing. Like, for many other factions, Aranis Assault Spite, who has a decent mount option as well, would be like very welcome. People would be stoked. But Vampire Coast are so spoiled with how good their lords are that obviously a lord like that is going to look a little bit haggard in comparison. So some of the best lord choices in the game, if not the best in multiplayer, being an undead faction with a crumbling mechanic, which I think is a little bit needs to be tuned a little bit more. So you can't even like break their back line. You get into the Vampire Coast back line and you really have to like grind through all that HP. The shock value isn't going to be, that substantial. You got to brute force your way through these bad boys. And unlike vampires who, if you're, alpha striking them or shooting them from a distance, they're going to fight back with their own cannons and guns, which is really crazy. So some of the best lords in the game, they also have access to the best lore of magic and lore of vampires. And the things that they can heal with it are pretty insane. Obviously, the vampire counts have some big scary monsters. You have zombie dragons. You have the Vargulf. Vargulf's not rocking that much armor. You have the Terrorgeist, which isn't the tankiest of beasts. But Vampire Coast has lore vampires, Invocation of Nehek, with access to some of the most insanely tanky beasts in the game. Rotting Prometheans have 120 armor, 48 base melee defense value for the basic version. They have the freaking Rotting Leviathans with 7k plus HP, 150 armor. Actually, surprisingly good combat stats for a monster that's based on bonus versus infantry, 52-42. So like, it's so difficult to kill them. And that kind of leads me on to my next point. Lore of Vampires, right? Really, really good. But Vampire Coast, and the reason why I think they're so much better than Vampire Counts, and not to say Vampire Counts are bad. Vampire Counts certainly might be better in niche matchups, but across the board, the Vampire Coast is much more impressive in my opinion. Vampire Coast has a really diverse roster. Their infantry are extremely cost effective. So let's go through it one by one, actually. We'll start with the heroes. So they have some decent hero choices. The Vampire Fleet Captains, their baseline casters, which are pretty common since you're going to be using Luther, have access, like I said, to the best lore of magic in the game. But on top of that, they have a really powerful ingrained ability that is on a relatively short 60-second cooldown. Taunt, 24% speed, negative 30 armor and melee defense. And when you stack that with Luther Harkins debuffs, dude, things just get out of control. On top of that, the Gunnery Wide is also very good. It's an excellent sniper, and we all know how powerful single entities are in Total War Warhammer 2. And Gunnery Wides on a Crab are not only good in melee, but they're also excellent at sniping. They can also use the replenished ammunition to give Luther's pistol pretty much infinite ammo, which really allows for some very degenerate play. And, the Mourngul Haunter is a little bit more niche. In the earlier days, he was better, but he's still very good. This bad boy does have some, some great offensive output, good AP values. He does also have the Chilling Aura, which is a slowing ability. And this, again, leads me on to what I was going to talk about, how dynamic the faction is. They can kind of do a little bit of everything and do it very well. Now, as far as their infantry goes, very cost-effective. Zombie Part Deccan mobs, though their stats kind of suck, it's 8,000 HP you have to get through, and the Halberd variant is even better. I mean, having a 400 gold unit, which has 8,000 HP, 120 models, and also has anti-large and good AP values, these guys are just a slog to get through. And honestly, if they're fighting something large, they perform exceptionally well. Syrenes are a really good disruption unit as well. Syrenes are able to be extremely mobile, 48 speed. They have a charmed mechanic, and they have of course, the ability to cause terror. Syrenes are a really good unit as well, so great infantry options. Now, one of the only units that I would say is kind of like bad on the Vampire Coast roster are Depth Guard with pole arms, but if I can only really identify like 2 or 3 bad units on a roster, then you're doing pretty good for yourself. Depth Guard a little bit more situational, but you guys get the picture. The missile infantry are amazing. Pistol mobs are really good, and like they have something for every occasion, right? Okay, you're playing against a faction that isn't armored. Hey, I got guns for that. I got bombers and I have pistol mobs, and we're going against big armor. Well, we have gunnery mobs, and we also have the deck gunners with RWAR that is really good in the form of the Shade Wraith gunners. Hand cannon's a little bit more niche, but they've still seen some very viable play and competitive play and done very well for themselves. So like their powder is so good. And yeah, they might not be as accurate as some other handgun units or have like the raw stopping power, but they do not break. Like you can pound them with enemy ammunition, artillery, mortars, whatever. They're in a loose formation, so they're going to be good against mortar fire. They just don't break. You put them in guard mode, even if they're being attacked, they're still going to be ripping shots and just doing tons of damage. But bombers really are one of the big winners on the roster. Zombie Part Gunnery Mob bombers are just so freaking good. Like, you don't even need to bring a front line sometimes. You just bring bombers in your front line, and they will destroy whatever infantry come into range. Even against armored infantry, it's surprisingly good. Zombie Pirate Gunnery Mob bombers are just so powerful. Their monsters are great. I mean, you have Fellbats, you have Scurvy Dogs, you have the baseline of Harass, you have the Bloaty Boy, of course, but that's more of a joke. The Mournguls are very good. Rotting Prometheans are very good. The Necrofex Colossus is amazing. The Goose is good. The Rotting Leviathan is good. The only ones that are subpar are the Animated Hulks and the Bloated Corpses. But, you gotta have... They're the spice of life. You gotta have some fun sometimes. And again, Deck Droppers can be very viable. Really good sniping tools. The Promethean gunnery mobs are also good. And their artillery is all great. Carronades are extremely cost effective. And again, they're unbreakable. So if you're in an artillery duel, even if your opponent has superior artillery, you're going to be able to sit and trade because you have access to Invocation and because your crew won't run where theirs will. Their mortars are good and Queen Bess is good as well. So we've kind of gone over the roster very, very quickly. And just to summarize like all of my points, I think Vampire Coast is the strongest faction because, number one, they have the best lore choices, in my opinion. Some of the best lore choices in the game. Just insanely good. They're undead, but they don't have like the limited nature of like old school undead, because I feel like Vampire counts were kind of bounced around the fact that they're very limited with the whole crumbling mechanic, but Vampire Coast doesn't have those drawbacks, right? Yeah, they're gonna crumble and whatnot, but they have guns, they have mobility, they have great monsters, they have good gooning potential. They can kind of do it all, and they have a really dynamic roster. That's another point. So that's number two, is that their dynamic roster, right? If you're playing against counts, you're playing, greenskins or whatever, you more or less know what you're going to see, right? You're going to have an idea like, okay, there's only like 2 or 3 viable builds maybe that are going to come against you. So you can kind of like prepare. But with Vampire Coast, they can effectively field artillery builds, handgun builds, mixed forces builds. They can do rush builds extremely effectively with Mournguls. They just can do so much. They have such a dynamic roster, so much of which is very powerful. So many viable lord choices that their playstyles can just be so diverse. So they really do that. And again, being a gunline faction that doesn't have the weakness of your backline being shattered and broken, and those handgun mobs being durable, is just absolutely ludicrous. And yeah, I think Vampire Coast, I mean, obviously, the way I may be talking this video might seem like, who could possibly beat them? Well, yeah, they can be beaten. But I would say if I were to do a tier list video, I would say Vampire Coast would by far be S tier. I think they, as well as maybe like a couple other factions, perhaps Greenskins, maybe Empire could be up there as well, depending on the player you're talking to. But I really do think that Vampire Coast is just so tough to deal with. And yeah, you know, they're one of my favorite factions. It's a shame because there's kind of this stigma about them, you know, where people will always be like, oh, Vampire Coast, goddammit. Like, you know, I always liked playing Vampire Coast, and their playstyle was so fun for me. But, you know, I always really like to play those like gunline factions like Dwarves. But yeah, Vampire Coast, man, those guys go deep. They don't mess around. And just kind of, you know, as well to talk about their weaknesses, they are weak to bowfire because, again, their pistol mobs and their handgun mobs have a range of 145. So if you're facing off against like archers, any sort of play like that, they can get melted really quickly by like huntsmen, right? And by crossbowmen, by quarrelers, by high elf archers. But a lot of good coast players have really learned to adapt by using shade wraith gunners and mortars to really just pound archer lines. So that's like the thing, right? The archers are typically a good counter, but Vampire Coast can do a couple things. They can go with an insane crab build with like double Leviathan with like healing, with like double Leviathan, Luther, with like a vampire caster, and then like just so hard to kill. Like your archers are going to struggle so hard against that 150 armor. Or they can go with a ranged gun line using mortars and shade wraith gunners and scurvy dogs to destroy your archer line. Or they can rush you with Mourngulls. Like there's so many things they can do, which really make them very unpredictable and also make it a rewarding experience to play Vampire Coast for me, because it's really like it's cool. It feels like you can really contour it to your playstyle. Like if you're a rush player, you can play them that way, and if you're a gunline player, monster player, a lord sniping player, whatever, like you can make them work. But I don't know. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this format. I know it's a little bit of ranting. I just wanted to kind of talk about Vampire Coast and why I thought they were the most powerful faction of the game. Typically, when I do videos, I just kind of go off the cuff. I don't really like reading from scripts. It just doesn't feel like me. It doesn't feel like my style. So if you guys enjoyed this format, let me know. I think if it's well received and you guys enjoyed it, I could do another one talking about the worst faction, in my opinion. You know, I think that stuff's interesting for the future of the meta development, and obviously could be good feedback for Creative Assembly to kind of check out. But yeah, I do think Vampire Coast is the strongest. They have a couple bad matchups in the Dwarves and the Empire, but aside from that, if we're looking across, they're fine against Beastmen. They wreck Bretonnia. They're good against Dark Elves. Typically, they wreck Dark Elves, in my opinion. Dwarves are their hard counter. Empire is a hard matchup for them, but I would say they have a chance of winning it. And against, like, looking at everyone else, like, I would feel very comfortable as a Vampire Coast main to go and compete against any of these other factions and feel like I would have at least a chance, if not an advantage, in many of these matchups. They do have some even matchups as well, but in general, I think Vampire Coast is a really good faction to specialize in. If you guys are looking to, like, be pretty serious and competitive, they're a great one to have in your repertoire. So definitely get in there and give it a try. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for joining. If you enjoyed the video, please let me know what subject matter you'd like to see in the comment section below. I know my thoughts may have been a little bit scatterbrained, but you know, I'm just so hyped, man. Just enjoying life and you know, surviving this damn Nurgle plague. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Appreciate all your support, and we'll see you guys back with some more of this content soon. Cheers.